Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Failure and mistakes are a part of life, and that, of course, includes the workplace. Failure comes in many different types, many different sizes, and many different levels of magnitude when it comes to the effects that failure or mistakes may have. When we consider failures and mistakes at the workplace, those can be examined at the individual level, the team level, or even the organizational level. How we interpret failure and mistakes depends on a number of things, one of which is perception, how we look at failure, how we see each specific particular failure or a mistake. How failures and mistakes are seen or perceived will affect how they're interpreted, how they're received when they happen. Some contributing factors to that may be things such as personalities or even an organization's culture. The question on everyone's mind is how to best handle failures and mistakes when they happen at the workplace. After all, we all want to decrease or even eliminate wherever possible failures and mistakes. Dealing with failures and mistakes at the workplace is everybody's responsibility. Leadership and management have their responsibility to deal with mistakes and failures at the workplace at the organizational level, and that includes the organization's culture. Individuals have a similar responsibility in that individuals have to deal with failures and mistakes at the individual level. But beyond that, when individuals come together, now we're talking about a collective response to failures and mistakes. That could be things such as teams, working all the way up to the entire workforce within an organization. As I already alluded to, the types of failures and mistakes that we can experience, they can be minute in their nature and have small effects, no more than inconveniences, maybe the inconvenience of having to repeat a task, but they can also be significant, where they can potentially cost an organization thousands of or millions of dollars. They can be detrimental and catastrophic in some circumstances. Maybe lives could be endangered or even lost. So when talking about mistakes and things that happen at the workplace, failures that happen at the workplace, we have to be able to remember this grand range of what a failure or a mistake could be. It could be, again, something along the lines of an annoyance or an inconvenience to something that is catastrophic. But regardless of what the failure or mistake is, it requires some kind of response or attention from us. When a mistake first happens, the first thing to do is to stop the proverbial bleeding. if there is a failure or a mistake that's happening, let's make whatever is happening that we don't want to be happening, let's make it stop. That's the first logical thing to consider here. Once the worst is over, it's important to look at prevention for the future. And again, prevention could look like many different things, from changing out software or getting a new tool to changing procedures or reworking entire policies of what and how things should be done. So that will be equivalent in terms of response to whatever the failure or mistake was. If it was a mistake that was not catastrophic in nature and could have been easily avoided, but could have also been relatively easily fixed, the fix for it, the prevention for it happening in the future, will not be as grand as something that would have been catastrophic in its effects. Something of that magnitude will require more time and effort in order to prevent it from happening in the future. But the idea remains the same. Once you stop the proverbial bleeding, let's look at how we can prevent this from happening in the future. It's important that you own your own mistakes. No blaming. That's the takeaway with this point. And this is as important at individual levels, group levels, as it is at the organizational levels. When something happens, there's usually a responsible party, whether that party is an individual, a group, or the entire organization. It's important to own that failure or mistake so that you can productively move forward in repairing the damages and preventing from this happening again in the future. And don't forget compassion, whether that's compassion for yourself if you've made a mistake or had a failure, to the compassion for others, be that other individuals or groups, or even the organization as a whole. Compassion is an important component of getting through failures and mistakes successfully. It's all too easy to get hung up on blaming and pointing fingers, but you and I both know that that goes nowhere, and usually that just makes things worse. If there is a wrong to be righted, then right that wrong. Make sure that things that need to be corrected, things that need to be fixed, are taken care of. When something happens, a mistake, a failure of some sort, you can't just leave it to fix itself or sweep it under the rug. So, righting all the wrongs is part of the process when dealing with failures and mistakes. Sometimes it may be appropriate to offer apologies, and if that's the case, don't be shy. Apologize for your failure or mistake. But remember, that's not always the case. I said sometimes it's appropriate to do that. So don't run around apologizing and making things even worse if that's not the right time or place for it, or if it's not called for an apology. So keep that in mind. Apologies are important when they're due, but apologizing frivolously takes away from the experience and diminishes it in the future. Be open to other people's perceptions or points of view on the situation, especially when they are points of view that are different from your own. Only by embracing other people's way of seeing things can we have a fuller, more complete understanding of what the situation is or was that led to a mistake or a failure, especially when we're dealing with big catastrophic issues. Being closed-minded and arguing solely from one point of view gets you nowhere. It is a comprehensive understanding of the complexity of the situation that allows you to formulate a better preventative measure, a better fix for the next time. So be open to other people's points of view, other people's perceptions, even if they're completely different from your own. Sometimes it may be appropriate to use humor to diffuse a tense situation after a mistake or a failure. Again, I say sometimes because this isn't something that's appropriate every time, but sometimes a little lightheartedness introduced into the situation, into the aftermath, may help people to loosen up so that they can get unstuck from the surprise or shock of what happened and get on track for fixing things and moving in the right direction. But again, remember, humor can be a wonderful thing, but make sure that it's appropriate. If it's not, or if you're not sure, you may want to skip it. And you've probably heard that mistakes or failures are a great opportunity to learn, and that is very, very true. So be prepared to seek out that learning opportunity from every failure and every mistake, because every failure and every mistake has a learning opportunity. If you're not seeing it, you're simply missing it. Perhaps you need to engage in conversation with others who could help you see what that learning opportunity is. But recognizing that learning opportunity is not the end. You have to be able to act on it. This is where preventing future mistakes or fixing what has happened needs to take place. So recognizing learning opportunities is just the beginning part of that particular point. We have to be able to successfully act on those learning opportunities. One, by learning, and two, by fixing what needs to be fixed. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Failures and mistakes are part of life, and that means part of life at the office. And while unpleasant, it is necessary to deal with them. We all want to eliminate or at least minimize failure and mistakes as much as possible, but they will happen no matter how careful we are. However, keep in mind that there are some best practices for dealing with failures and mistakes effectively, helping us to prevent them in the future and have perhaps new policies or new rules or ways of doing things moving forward to help us to minimize or eliminate these failures and mistakes. When we first encounter a failure or a mistake, first thing to do is to stop that proverbial bleeding, stop whatever is happening. Of course, sometimes it has already stopped on its own, but you want to make sure that more damage will not continue to happen. So stop the proverbial bleeding. Once you do that, start thinking about how to prevent this from happening in the future, big or small, whatever the mistake or failure was. They are all important in terms of future prevention. Own your failures and mistakes. That means no blaming and no pointing fingers at others. And don't forget compassion. That means both compassion for yourself and for others who may have made the mistake. Right the wrongs and offer apologies as appropriate. Be open to other people's points of view and their perceptions of the situation. Together, you can come up with a more comprehensive and more effective way of preventing these failures and mistakes in the future. Humor can sometimes be a wonderful thing to diffuse the situation and help people to get unstuck from the aftermath of a mistake or a failure, but use it with caution. Knowing when it's appropriate is key here. And last but certainly not least, it's critical to recognize all of the learning opportunities that always come along with failures and mistakes. But recognizing these opportunities is only the beginning. Acting on them is the key here. So being proactive, learning how to prevent issues in the future, and then actually being proactive and doing something to make that happen are key. As the week unfolds, I invite you to think about failures and mistakes at the workplace as you experience them from an individual point of view, your own mistakes and failures, and for the failures and mistakes that surround you that are owned by others, maybe other individuals or groups collectively, or even the organization. How have you dealt with them? How have others dealt with them? What can you do to improve how you deal with mistakes and failures so that you can minimize or even prevent them in the future, but also so that you can be a role model for others how to most effectively deal with failures and mistakes. Once you start to think along these lines, and once you become proactive in dealing with these types of situations effectively, they will become easier to deal with, and I imagine that they will diminish for you as well, because you will be a lot more aware and a lot more conscious of your own actions and the actions of those around you. And the more you practice, the better you'll get at catching yourself and catching things within the surrounding situations before they actually become failures or mistakes. So it's so important to practice these simple best practices that are so effective. So I invite you to do that this week and consider how you can better manage the mistakes and failures in your own experience and the experience of your surroundings. For those of you who are experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel. There you will find the video version of the podcast. The link for that is in the description below, so I invite you to check it out. In addition to the video version of the podcast, my YouTube channel also has videos that focus on stress management. So I invite you to give that a look and see what you can enjoy there. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.